I'm Natalie Brooks, 32, the youngest in my family. I'd hoped that maybe this time things would be different, but they still made sure I wasn't part of their circle. At the wedding, my seat was far from the family table. What happened next made every head turn my way. The street narrowed as I turned in my rental car tires crunching over scattered leaves. November sunlight slanted low, catching the silver of the gate at the end of my parents' driveway. At first I thought someone had set trash out early for pickup. 3 black garbage bags were piled at the edge of the property seams, straining one half open so that a faded gray sweater sleeve hung out and stirred in the wind. I slowed, pulling to the curb. The air smelled faintly of damp leaves and the acrid tang of chimney smoke. On the porch, my mother stood with her arms folded, a phone dangling loosely in one hand. She didn't wave. My brother Eric leaned against the railing, eyes fixed on something on his screen, the corner of his mouth curled like he'd just read a private joke. My father was by the doorway, resting on one hip, not making a move to come down the steps. Stepping out of the car, I let the door shut softly. The sound seemed to carry anyway. A few houses down, Mrs. Givens was walking her terrier, the leash taut, as the little dog tried to stop and sniff. She slowed, eyes sliding from me to the gate, then up to my mother. "Your things are outside," Mom called, her voice flat but pitched to carry over the hedge. It was loud enough for Mrs. Givens to hear without straining. I didn't answer. The bags were heavy, the plastic crinkling as I lifted the first into my trunk. The open one held a stack of books, some with bent spines, a few paperbacks swollen from moisture. I adjusted them carefully before closing the lid. Eric spoke without looking up. "Guess she got the message." The words were light, almost conversational, but I felt their weight settle between my shoulder blades. I moved to the second bag. Something clinked inside, mugs wrapped in dish towels, one handle chipped. I placed it next to the first, aligning them so nothing would shift during the drive. The wind caught the sweater sleeve from the torn bag again, flicking it outward like a flag. My mother's gaze followed the movement but didn't land on me. The porch boards creaked. My father stepped forward, a small cardboard box in his hands. He didn't toss it. He dropped it onto the damp grass with a dull thud. "You're 30, Nat. Time to move on." The box tipped, spilling its contents. On top was a framed photo from my college graduation, me in a cap and gown smiling at someone just off camera. The glass was cracked in 2 clean lines like an X over my face. I crouched, brushing off a bit of dirt from the frame, then set it gently in the trunk beside the bags. Closing the trunk, I kept my movements slow, almost deliberate, like every hinge and latch deserved attention. "Enjoy your holiday," I said, my voice even. The gate's hinge squealed faintly as the wind nudged it open a few inches. I got back in the car. Through the side mirror, Eric's phone rose, angled just enough to catch me sitting there, hands on the wheel. I turned the key. Mrs. Givens tugged her dog toward the next block, glancing back twice. The garbage bags were still there, the gate still swaying when I pulled away. I didn't turn on the radio. The road out of my parents' subdivision curved past the elementary school and the small brick church with the message board that said, "Welcome home for the holidays." I caught my reflection in the windshield when the light turned red, hair pulled back, jaw relaxed, eyes steady. I rested both hands at 10 and 2 and waited for the signal to change. At the first gas station, I pulled in and lifted the trunk. The bags had shifted an inch, not enough to matter. A corner of the cracked frame pressed against a box of kitchen things. I slid the frame to the side and tucked a towel between the glass and the cardboard so it wouldn't rub on the drive. The wind smelled like cold metal and gasoline. Somewhere behind me, a bell over a door chimed, and a kid laughed high and bright, then faded. Back on the highway, the skyline sharpened, then fell away to rows of warehouses. My phone, face down in the cup holder, buzzed once, then again, then went quiet. I let it be. The steady hum of the tires pulled a rhythm through the cabin, a low thread I could follow without thinking. When I exited for my place, the sun had tipped lower, turning the buildings the color of tea. I parked under the maple with the peeling bark and carried the first bag upstairs. My neighbor on 3, a nurse who left at odd hours, was propping her door with a shoe. She nodded. "Back in town? Just got in," I said. I shifted the weight on my shoulder. She held the door a second longer than needed, and then let it go. Inside, I set the bag on the living room floor and clicked on the lamp. The shade threw a warm triangle against the wall, leaving the rest of the room in soft shadow. I emptied the bag to sort 2 mugs, a chipped plate, a scarf. I'd forgotten I owned a stack of paperbacks, edges feathered from years of use. I stacked the books with the spines all facing out, then ran a finger along the bent corner of one until it lay flat. The second bag held sweaters folded in a way that wasn't mine. They smelled like the laundry soap my mother preferred, sharp floral, nothing like the clean plain powder I used. I shook out a black cardigan and hung it on the back of the chair. A button clinked when it hit the wood. I found the loose thread and wound it back through the hole twice, then tied a small knot on the inside, smooth as a stitch you wouldn't notice unless you were looking. The cracked frame went on last. I set it on the kitchen counter and angled it under the lamp. The split lines crossed over my face like quiet roads on a map, not zigzags, not spiderwebs, just 2 clean cuts. I lifted the tabs and slid the photo out. It made a soft sigh against the cardboard backing. Underneath the glass, the image looked whole again. I pressed the edges flat and slipped it into a drawer by the sink with the warranty cards and extra keys. When I finally picked up my phone, the screen filled with stacked notifications, a text from Karen with a single line. "We left a few things on the porch you forgot," and a second, "Please return the house key before Thursday." Eric had left a voice message. "Mom's stressed. Don't make this bigger." My call log showed 2 missed calls from Thomas, no voicemail. I set the phone back down without opening anything. The apartment settled around me. The heater kicked on with its familiar tick-tick before the warm air pushed through the vents. Outside, a car door shut, then footsteps on the stairs, then silence. I unpacked the last bag and wiped the counters with slow, even strokes. A spoon clattered once against the sink and spun before it stilled. On the small dining table, I placed 3 things in a neat line: my spare set of work gloves, an old planner with the elastic band broken, and a plain manila folder I'd carried through 3 moves without opening. I didn't open it now either. I just set it square to the edge of the table and pressed my palm to it for a second, long enough to feel the smoothness of the paper and the faint ridge where the clasp rested underneath. I made tea and stood by the window while the kettle clicked back to quiet. Across the street, a delivery driver balanced a stack of boxes on one hip and nudged a doorbell with his elbow. The boxes wobbled, then steadied. He exhaled in relief, and those little clouds of breath rose and disappeared. When the tea was ready, I didn't sit. I sipped it standing, letting the steam hit my face, the heat settling into my fingers. My phone buzzed again, a different tone, calendar reminder for a job briefing in the morning. I cleared the notice and swiped to the camera by habit. The last photo saved was from the airport lot 2 days ago, my suitcase standing upright next to a painted number on the asphalt. No faces, just a marker so I could find the car. I deleted it and locked the screen. Before bed, I took one last trip down to the car for the final bag. The hallway smelled faintly of someone's dinner, sage butter, something baking. I paused to listen. A pot lid rattled once, then lifted, then settled. The sound made me think of our kitchen at home, the squeak of the cabinet where the spices were kept, the tiny chip on the enamel teapot spout. I turned the key, lifted the bag, locked up, and climbed the stairs without looking back over the parking lot. Inside, I lined the 3 garbage bags neatly against the wall, empty now, folded twice so the creases lay flat. I switched off the lamp. The room faded to the amber strip of light that slipped under the blinds and the blinking red of the smoke detector. I lay down and stared at the ceiling until the shadows sorted themselves into their usual corners. In the morning, the apartment felt bigger, as if air had been added to the rooms overnight. I made coffee and set out a single plate. A sneaker squeaked in the hallway, then a door closed down the line. My phone was face down, quiet. I left it that way and let the kettle come to a boil without hurrying it along. When the steam curled along the cabinet doors, I turned off the burner and listened to the soft ping of metal cooling. By late afternoon, pale winter light stretched across my living room, catching on the folds of the cardigan still hanging over the chair. I had kept it there without deciding why. The thread I'd mended earlier was almost invisible now. You'd only notice if you ran your fingertip across it. I set the cardigan over the back of the couch and stepped away. The rest of the apartment was quiet enough that small sounds stood out: the faint hum of the refrigerator, the dull click of the baseboard heater turning off. Somewhere above me, a chair leg scraped across the floor. I walked to the window and looked out at the street, no cars moving, just the wind pressing at the branches of the maple tree. I thought about the way Karen had stood at the gate, her hand on the strap of her purse, voice clipped as if reading a script. The look in her eyes when she saw me pick up the first bag, something between impatience and relief. I remembered the exact way she'd tilted her head before saying, "You're 29. Get out now." And how my own answer hadn't been words, just turning toward the car. I pulled a blanket from the closet and spread it across the end of the couch, smoothing the edges until they lined up. The tea from earlier had cooled in its mug. I poured it into the sink and rinsed the cup in a thin stream of water. The drain made a soft gurgle, then went still again. I left the cup upside down on the rack to dry. By the time evening came on, the streetlights had lit in a staggered row, halos of pale gold under the darkening sky. I closed the blinds halfway and turned the lamp back on. Its light was warmer now, catching the corners of the room in a softer frame. My phone buzzed once on the counter, then fell silent. I didn't check it. I took the manila folder from the table and slid it into the top drawer of my desk, where it would be easy to find without having to see it every day. The drawer closed with a muted thud. I stood for a moment with my hand resting on it, feeling the faint vibration from the heater kicking in again. The apartment smelled faintly of the coffee I'd made earlier, now cooled into the air. I wrapped the blanket around my shoulders and sat on the couch, knees drawn up, watching the thin line of light under the blinds fade as night settled in. Somewhere in the building, a door closed softly and footsteps moved away down the hall. I leaned back, listening. Not for calls, not for messages, just for the ordinary sounds of my own space. They came slow and even nothing urgent, nothing pulling me out into the cold. The first time I saw my parents again after that day at the gate was at Eric's engagement party. The invitation had arrived in my email weeks earlier, addressed to Natalie, no dear, no warmth, just the date, time, and location typed in plain text. I read it twice before closing the laptop. It wasn't the absence of apology that got me, it was the assumption I would show up anyway. The venue was a glass-walled event space downtown, the kind of place where the walls reflected back every bit of light, so you could see yourself from 3 different angles. I arrived alone, wearing a deep navy dress that fell just below the knee, a quiet choice in a room full of sequins and champagne gold. My shoes barely made a sound on the polished floor. Karen spotted me first. She didn't wave. She pressed her lips together like she was sealing an envelope. Beside her, Thomas's face was a practiced neutral. Eric, of course, was in the center of the room, telling a story to a half-circle of guests. His fiancée Claire laughed in the right places, her hand lightly on his arm. I found a small table near the back, close enough to watch without being drawn into conversation. The clink of cutlery on china carried through the hum of music and voices. Waitstaff moved between tables, their trays glinting under the overhead lights. From here I could see Karen lean in toward a cluster of her friends, her voice low, but her gestures pointed. A few of them turned to glance in my direction, their eyes sweeping past me like I was part of the decor. The evening moved in small, calculated rhythms, speeches, toasts, the presentation of the engagement cake. My parents stayed close to Eric and Claire, their attention a steady spotlight. I could almost trace its beam as it moved with them, illuminating every handshake and photo. When Thomas finally approached me, it wasn't to ask how I'd been. "You could have called your brother?" he said, keeping his voice low. "It would have been polite." I set my glass down gently. "He knew where to find me," I replied. He didn't answer, just gave a brief nod before returning to the brighter circle of guests. I sat back, feeling the hum of conversation fill the space where his presence had been. Halfway through the evening, a small band began to play near the front. Guests drifted toward the makeshift dance floor. My parents clapped along, their faces open and bright for the cameras. I stayed at my table, the music threading around me like a current I chose not to step into. From where I sat, I could see the gift table near the entrance. Among the glossy boxes and crisp gift bags, one package stood out, wrapped in plain brown paper tied with twine. It was mine. I hadn't meant for it to be noticed, but the contrast made it impossible to ignore. A few guests eyed it curiously, whispering. Karen noticed too. Her gaze settled on it, then flicked to me. She didn't approach. Instead, she whispered something to Claire, who laughed lightly before moving on to greet another guest. The evening blurred into a steady stream of polite laughter, staged photographs, and the quiet sense of being deliberately bypassed. By the time dessert was served, I knew I wouldn't stay until the end. I finished my coffee, slowly letting its bitterness ground me. When I rose to leave, the chatter around me didn't falter. I slipped out through the side entrance, the sound of the band fading behind me. The air outside was cooler, carrying the faint scent of rain. As I walked toward my car, I thought of the gift on that table, plain, unassuming, but holding something they wouldn't expect. Something that would wait. The rain had started by the time I reached my apartment. Thin, slanted lines tapping against the windows, a quiet counterpoint to the evening's polished noise. I set my keys down and kicked off my shoes, leaving them by the door. The silence was immediate, almost too still, but it was mine. On the coffee table sat the duplicate of the gift I'd left at the engagement party, a small wooden box I had commissioned weeks earlier. It wasn't expensive in the traditional sense, but it held something of value that money couldn't quite buy. Inside were photographs, old letters, and a single newspaper clipping that told a story my parents had long preferred to forget. The copy here was for me, the one I left there. Well, I wasn't sure when they'd open it. The following days passed without comment from my family. No calls, no messages, not even a half-hearted email. It was as though my presence at the party had been edited out of the memory entirely. In their version, the evening had been perfect, seamless, untouched by the small, quiet detail sitting on the gift table. By Friday, I'd nearly stopped thinking about it when a message from an old neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, popped up on my phone. "Saw you at the engagement party. You looked lovely. They didn't deserve you." I read it twice before replying with a simple, "Thank you." Mrs. Thompson had known me since I was a child. She'd seen the little fractures in our family long before I had words for them. That short message from her landed heavier than any speech could have. Later that afternoon, I stopped by the local market for groceries. In the aisle by the dairy section, I ran into an old high school friend, Michelle. She had heard about the party. So she said casually, "Was it as fancy as they made it sound?" I gave a small smile. "It was elaborate." Michelle chuckled, but her eyes searched mine for something more. I didn't give it. Some stories weren't meant to be shared in passing between the milk and the yogurt. Back at home, I unpacked the groceries in silence. The box on my table caught the light from the kitchen window, the wood warm against the fading afternoon. I thought about the look on Karen's face when she'd spotted the one at the party. Curiosity, hesitation, maybe a hint of unease. The weekend came and went without incident. I kept to my routines: morning coffee on the balcony, quiet evenings with a book. I didn't check social media, though I knew there would be photos from the engagement posted by friends of friends. It wasn't until Monday morning that the first ripple reached me. Another message, this time from an unfamiliar number. "Is this Natalie? I think we need to talk." No name, no context. Just the kind of sentence that sits heavy in your stomach. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I set the phone down and walked to the window. Outside, the street was still damp from the night's rain, reflecting the pale light of a slow sunrise. Part of me knew this was connected to the gift. The other part knew I'd done nothing wrong. The truth was theirs to face whenever they chose to lift the lid. Until then, I could wait. I'd been doing it my whole life. I picked up the phone, read the message again, and let it sit there unanswered, the way a sealed envelope waits on a desk. Sometimes silence speaks loudest. The rest of Monday slipped by in that muted way days do when you're waiting for something you can't name. I went about work from home emails, a few calls, but my focus drifted. That message stayed on my phone screen like it had weight. By evening, I had convinced myself not to respond. If it was important enough, they would find another way to reach me. On Tuesday, I stopped by the small coffee shop down the street, the one with the mismatched chairs and the habit of overfilling their mugs. I'd just taken my first sip when I heard my name. Natalie. I turned to see Karen's fiancé's cousin, someone I barely knew. She looked hesitant, almost guilty. She fidgeted with the strap of her bag before speaking. "I saw the box. At the party." Her voice dropped quieter. "They've been talking about it all week. Not to you, of course, but They're unsettled. I kept my expression neutral, taking another sip of coffee. It wasn't meant to unsettle anyone. I know, she said quickly. It's just, no one knew you'd kept all that. The articles, the photos. It's like they forgot any of it ever happened. There was a pause. She shifted her weight as though deciding whether to say more. I think it's why your mom called everyone over on Sunday. She wanted to clarify things. Clarify. I'd heard that word before in our family. It usually meant rewriting. When I returned home, I placed the coffee cup in the sink and let the water run over it. My thoughts kept circling back to the way Karen's cousin had looked at me, part caution, part respect. Not pity. That at least was something. Wednesday brought a thin envelope in the mail, no return address. Inside was a single photograph, me at about 8 years old, standing in front of the family house. My expression was blank, my hands tucked behind my back. On the reverse, in a handwriting I didn't recognize, was a date and nothing else. I set it next to the duplicate box on my table. Another piece of the same quiet puzzle. That night, as I was locking the door, I heard footsteps in the hall. Mrs. Thompson was on her way in, groceries in hand. She smiled faintly. "They're not ready, you know," she said without preamble. "For what? To see you differently?" I didn't answer. Instead, I held the door for her, letting her pass into the warm light of her apartment. Back inside my own, I sat at the table, the photo between my hands. The edges were worn, the paper soft from time. I thought about the party, the way no one had expected me to leave so quietly. The truth was, the silence I carried wasn't empty, it was waiting. Somewhere in that house, the box still sat unopened. And one day, when it was the conversations they'd avoided for decades, would have to happen. I wouldn't have to say a word. The morning of the gathering came with an oddly sharp clarity in the air, the kind you get just before a storm breaks. I dressed simply: dark slacks, a cream blouse, and tied my hair back. No jewelry, no flourish. I didn't want them to read intention where there was none. The drive to my parents' house felt longer than usual, though the streets were quiet. The maple trees lining the main road were almost bare now, their last leaves clinging in shades of rust and gold. It was a day that could have been warm if not for the wind. When I arrived, the driveway was already full. A few cars I didn't recognize were parked along the curb. Through the living room window, I could see shadows moving, the curve of shoulders bent toward one another. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of cinnamon and roast meat holiday scents, even though it wasn't a holiday. Karen stood near the dining table arranging silverware, her face carefully neutral until she saw me. "You came?" she said, as if it were unexpected. "I was invited," I replied. My voice carried no challenge, just fact. Conversations quieted slightly as I stepped further in. Thomas was at the far end of the table speaking to a man in a gray suit, someone I didn't know. Eric leaned against the wall, sipping from a glass. He glanced at me, then quickly away. The first part of the afternoon passed in the strained civility I'd anticipated. Questions about work, about the weather. I answered politely, offering nothing extra. Then, midway through the meal, Karen cleared her throat. "Before dessert, I think we should address the recent events." Forks paused midair. The man in the suit shifted slightly, eyes moving between us. Karen continued, "There's been some misunderstanding about certain memories and items that were found." "You mean the box?" I said quietly. Her eyes flicked to mine. "Yes, the box. I want to make sure everyone here understands it was never meant to be taken the wrong way." Something in me settled then, like a puzzle piece clicking into place. I reached into my bag and drew out the photograph that had arrived in the mail. I placed it gently on the table, face up. "This was sent to me," I said. "No note, no explanation, just the date on the back. You all know what year that was." The silence was immediate, deep enough to hear the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Eric straightened slightly. Thomas's hand tightened around his glass. "I kept the box because it's part of my life." I continued, my voice even. "It's not a threat, it's not leverage. It's mine." No one moved to take the photograph. It lay there between us, a small, undeniable truth. Karen opened her mouth, then closed it again. She looked to Thomas, but he didn't meet her gaze. I let the moment stretch long enough for the weight of it to settle in every corner of the room. Then I slid the photo back toward me, placed it in my bag, and reached for my glass of water. "Shall we have dessert?" I asked, as if nothing at all had happened. No one answered right away. Then slowly, Eric set down his drink and pushed back his chair. "I think I will," he said quietly. And just like that, the air shifted, not warm, not welcoming, but altered. Something unspoken had changed, and they all knew it. Karen busied herself with slicing the pie, but the movement was too precise, too deliberate. She was buying time. The clink of the knife against the dish rang sharper than it should have, a nervous metronome that everyone heard but pretended not to. I accepted a plate when it came to me offering a polite thank you. My tone was the same as it would be with a stranger handing me change at a store. Karen's eyes searched mine for something, anger perhaps, or forgiveness. I gave her neither. Thomas tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, mentioning a neighbor who'd sold their house. It fell flat. The man in the gray suit asked how long the neighborhood had been established, clearly trying to ease the tension, but no one followed his lead. I took a small bite of pie, the cinnamon warm against my tongue. Around me, the scrape of forks on porcelain was the only sound. Then Eric spoke, not looking at anyone in particular. "I didn't send it," he said. No one had accused him outright, but the denial came like a flare in the dark. My eyes met his, and for the first time that afternoon, he didn't look away. "I believe you," I said simply. Karen's hands tightened on her fork. "Well, I certainly didn't." She stopped herself, realizing too late that no one had asked. I let her words hang unanswered, then leaned back slightly in my chair. "It doesn't matter who sent it. It matters that it was kept from me for so long." The photograph was no longer on the table, but its presence lingered. It had become a silent participant in the room, a reminder they couldn't bury. After a while, Karen rose to refill the coffee cups. She stood behind my chair for a moment, perhaps hoping I'd look up. I didn't. When I finally did speak again, it was to the man in the suit. "I never caught your name." "Michael," he said. "Old family friend." I smiled faintly. "Then you've seen the best and the worst." A brief, awkward laugh moved through the table, but it carried no warmth. I set down my fork and folded my napkin neatly. "Thank you for the meal," I said, my voice steady. "I have a long drive ahead." No one stopped me. Thomas nodded faintly. Karen mumbled something about leftovers. At the door, I paused just long enough to slip on my coat. Through the narrow hallway mirror, I caught a glimpse of them, still seated, still holding themselves carefully, as if one wrong movement might shatter the thin surface of civility we'd managed to keep. I stepped outside into the crisp air. The wind tugged at my hair, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The sound was strangely grounding. I walked to my car without looking back. The photograph was safe in my bag, its edges pressing lightly against my side. I wasn't sure when or if I'd look at it again, but I knew it no longer belonged in their silence. I was halfway to the car when the front door opened again. Footsteps on the porch. The gray suit. Michael cleared his throat gently. "Ms. Brooks," he said, using a tone I hadn't heard all afternoon. It carried. Not loud, not stern, official. "Before you go, there's one thing we should complete." Karen appeared behind him, napkin still in her hand. Thomas followed, hesitant, as if the threshold itself had grown taller. A few relatives drifted to the doorway, drawn by the air shifting. Michael stepped down onto the walk. Up close, the old family friend smile had been replaced by something cleaner. "We've met before," he said to my parents, "but not in this capacity." He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a thick sealed envelope. "Michael Dorset. Counsel." He offered his card to Thomas, then to Karen. The white rectangle looked very small between their fingers. No one spoke. Wind rustled the hedges and carried the smell of cinnamon out into the yard. From across the street, a screen door clicked. Mrs. Givens had stepped onto her stoop terrier tucked against her hip. She didn't pretend not to look. "For the record," Michael said, "tone even. This is formal notice regarding Ms. Natalie Brooks's co-ownership interests in the Riverbend commercial property and the Lake Cedar cabin. You've conducted transactions and collected income without her consent." He glanced at the envelope without handing it over yet. "Effective immediately, a third-party management company will administer rents and disburse Ms. Brooks's share. Payments begin next month. Any further transfer lien or lease absent her signature will be treated as fraudulent. The word didn't slam, it landed flat true like a stamp on paper. Eric had come to the porch rail. His face was pale, but he was listening. Thomas started to say something about timing. Michael waited, and the sentence unraveled on its own. Karen's napkin twisted once in her hand, then twice. "This isn't," she began and stopped. The recording light on her phone screen glowed faintly through the thin fabric red dot, steady as a heartbeat. Michael set the envelope in Thomas's open palm. "You'll also find an accounting of arrears and a proposed schedule," he said. "We'll expect written acknowledgement by Friday. Counsel for you is CC'd." His gaze didn't linger. The sentence closed itself. I didn't move closer. I didn't need to. The air did the carrying for us down the walk across the curb to where Mrs. Givens stood with her dog, to the cousins behind the doorframe, to the uncle who lowered his coffee cup without realizing it. A sparrow hopped across the lawn, tugging at a blade of dry grass. Everything for a moment felt sharply outlined. Eric looked at me then. Not a plea, not anger, something else. Recognition, quiet and late. He nodded once. I returned it, the smallest movement. Karen's fingers finally stilled. She looked past Michael to me. There was nothing for me to add. The picture on the dining table, the box at the party, the envelope, now each had been a door. They were the ones who had to walk through. Michael snapped his briefcase closed. "We're available if you have questions," he said, and the offer held no apology. He stepped aside, giving me the walkway. I passed them at a normal pace. No flourish, no pause. The gravel under my shoes made a soft crunch. At the curb, I opened my car door and set my bag on the passenger seat. In the reflection of the window, the house stood behind me, porch full of faces, the envelope a bright shape against Thomas's dark coat. Across the street, Mrs. Givens lifted her chin, a neighbor's blessing that said more than words. The terrier wriggled once and settled. I slid into the driver's seat and laid both hands on the wheel. The engine turned over on the first try. A leaf skittered along the pavement and caught in the gutter. No one called my name. Before I pulled away, I looked once at the gate. The hinges had been oiled since November. It no longer squealed when the wind nudged it. It swung and settled quiet like a breath you finally let out. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. I eased the car into gear and let the street carry me forward past the mailbox, past the line where the lawn meets the sidewalk, past the place where 3 black bags once stood, where I had learned that leaving and being gone are different verbs. At the corner, the light changed. I turned without hurry, the photograph in my bag pressing a thin rectangle against the fabric. Behind me, the house grew small in the rear view, then smaller still until it was just another roofline under a pale afternoon sky. No one followed. Some endings don't sound like doors slamming. They sound like wind moving through a place you no longer stand in, soft, unhurried, certain. Weeks later, I still catch the scent of cinnamon on a cold breeze, and I know it isn't from their kitchen. It's just the air reminding me that some rooms only feel warm once you've stepped outside.